So I have the unfortunate, as Tom referred to, time slot of talking to you after you've all eaten, and the majority of the blood has left your head and your brain and is now focused on digesting your food. So it's gonna be tough, guys, but we are going to do this together. I know we can, but I can't do it alone, okay? So you have to be with me. How many of you have heard this statement with regard to BIM? It's 10% technology, 90% sociology. We're starting to hear it a little more. Yes, you can, come on, like, work it, you know, we have to stay awake for this one. Okay. How many people think you're leaving by this statement as you talk about implementing BIM? Yeah, I feel some of the same way. You know, this statement has been around in the US as, you know, it's all about the people and all these things, but we haven't really changed our process based on that. And it's interesting though, because anything you do is all about the people, right? I mean, we have some lovely vendors here, but I can tell you, and they will probably agree with me, that their tools do not build models or design or build buildings or operate them without humans to interface with things and unfortunately interface with each other, which is always interesting. And so it really is it's all about us. It's all about us, and we need to pay attention to that a little bit differently, I think. And I'd like to share with you a little bit about Tocci's experience. As Tom said, we're a construction management general contracting firm in the Northeast United States. It depends on the year, and the past few years have just been, well, great. So we do, you know, a few $100 million worth of work every year. Fluctuating, of course, recently. And this is something that we really use to change our practice, and I'd like to share some of that with you. Here's what we're going to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about context, who we are, and so it makes sense a little more. Give you a little bit of our inspiration. I really had put inspiration there, but I felt it was sort of, I don't know if it will be inspiring to you, but that's what really drives us. We'll talk a little bit about our BIM implementation and the evolution of that very briefly. And then I really want to share with you 3 frameworks that come from more of the sociological side that we're using. And then, of course, I'll ramble on with some concluding thoughts, if that sounds good. So a little bit about us. We're a very typical New England contractor. You know, John Tocci's grandfather started the company, came over from Italy, and started a masonry contracting firm. And this is his grandfather is all the way on the left, and his father is in a sailor suit, and there were actually a few more children after that. And then, of course, traditions continued, and John's father took over the company, and then John took over as well in 1985, and really started to look more at technology and what it can do. And today, you know, this is where we are and who we are, and we are a very rooted in our technology, as I talked about. And I think what's important here is not so much, you know, the storybook of the Tocci family and the company, but also that we're builders. We're practical builders and really see the value in performing work efficiently, performing work to high quality, and performing work safely. And so that's really who we are, and we've seen extensions into, you know, the design phase and operation phase, but we're all about the field here. We have had some recent prominence because we started in 2006. We really took a serious look at our process and implemented BIM. So we have had the privilege of sharing the stage with some of the folks like I'm sharing with today, some implementers and some great folks. We work with the BIM Forum, and actually John founded the BIM Forum, which I advise you, you know, take a look at the website, bimforum.org. It's an interdisciplinary organization, one of the only times that the contractors and architects have truly collaborated through our trade organizations. And this is something that we've been doing as we've been traveling a lot and learning about what other people in other countries are doing. We do work in 10 different market segments, and this just shows from a range of whether it's hotels, whether it's residential, federal work, healthcare, pharmaceutical, commercial, everything. So we do quite a range of work, but it's all vertical. We don't do roads and highways and horizontal work and things like that. And of course, a little bit about what is a piece of our inspiration is also that we, as a company, do a lot of humanitarian efforts. That's an important part of that, because part of our giving back is through the industry as well as that. But on to what really inspires us. We are inspired by our train wreck of an industry to improve. So we're dirty, and this is the US. I'm sure you guys are much better here than we are, although I sense from David's presentation earlier that the UK is well driven, and I'm sure all of you are driven by some sense of improvement. But we feel that we're pretty dirty. We don't do a good job of meeting our commitments at all. So owners say that architects' drawings suck, but it's okay because architects would say, no, contractors can't read them anyway, so why would we put more time into them? So we're all equally at fault here, and I want to make that very, very clear. Change orders are rampant in our industry. This is a study that finally sort of normalized that. It varies on project to project, but this is a pretty poor showing for our industry. And this to us is this is horrible. This is how much material we waste. So we're dirty in this totally different way of, it's not just carbon emissions, we're throwing away material. 14% of that is virgin material. And so it's, it's pretty upsetting to see that what we do. And of course, I'm sure most have seen this. Not only do we waste our materials, but we're wasting our time. So most of my day as a traditional project manager would be wasted. I wouldn't be working on the actual project. I love that we're in the US, the construction industry is the only non-farm industry to actually go backwards in productivity. It's terrible. So we looked at that and we said, there has to be a better way. And actually, John was going to shut the office doors after he retired. He wasn't going to pass the business on to his kids. He said, do not come into this business. Don't do it. Go do something else. It's not worth it. I'm spending more money on attorney's fees than I am anything else. It's not where I want to be, and not where I want my children to be. And then just a few years later, after his kids started working and going into college and different programs, John started to see building information modeling and has admitted himself that he's had to eat his words on that remark. And luckily, one of his children did not listen to him, and so does work in construction and is seeing and appreciating what we're doing. But where we started with this was technology. Got really excited. I don't know, the first time, we started seeing people doing clash detection in the early 2000s, and it was really a big thing. This was really exciting. And we had lots of bits and clicks and interesting programs and doing interesting things, whether it was combining laser scanning with actual coordination work, and it's really, really great. And we saw an ROI about 2 to 1. I'm happy to share some of the details of that with you separately, but not really the time for the calculation here. And that was good. 2 to 1 is pretty good on an investment, but not necessarily what we were looking for. And so we started to see that if we collaborated with architects and engineers and owners who could use these tools as well, we would need a better process, and we could see some more, greater sense of ROI. And so we made lots of fun, complex process maps. We'd used a lot with Post-its. I really do love some Post-its. We figured out a lot of workflows. This particular one is an integrated team workflow for model-based shop drawing review. And it was just really exciting. And it was really cool on this project. But the other piece of it is that we couldn't repeat it on every project, because some project teams were more interested and some, it just wasn't working on each one. Everything's unique. And so while we were seeing as high as an ROI of 4 to 1 on some of our, what we would consider our best VDC, our best virtual design and construction or BIM projects, we weren't seeing it equally across the board. And for us, this sort of aha, but really it's a blinding flash of the obvious, was that BIM for us became a magnifying glass for not just the problems in our industry, but also our shortcomings as a company. Forget the fact that we're not doing BIM, we had some siloed departments internally. We weren't always the best at communication. And when we started to use BIM, when we started to use tools that required us to be transparent, we really saw a lot about where we could have improved separate from BIM. That was a really interesting thing for us, and we realized that, okay, so we're slightly less than perfect, and maybe we need to look into that a little bit more. And that's when we started looking at the sociological side of things. And this is the piece of it that really excites me, with who we are as people and what drives us and how do we create teams and things like that. I actually, for the BIM Forum, ran a conference was it earlier this year? It wasn't last April, it was this past April, on what we called the human side of BIM, talking about all these different aspects that we as an industry have to address, whether it's forming teams, whether it's dealing with the generational divide, which is this whole separate sort of trend right now that we're seeing that we have to deal with separate from the technology and all these other pieces that we're all seeing in every industry. And to us, this was really the key, is how do we get us to work together in a way that's effective? How do you get people motivated to do BIM? How do you build teams in a way that doesn't alienate their previous processes? How do you select a BIM champion? What is a BIM strategy? Do you need a BIM strategy? You know, all these kinds of things. So we really started to ask ourselves questions and saw some changes. So now I'm going to share a few things. I'd like to share 3 things with you. You know, I'll explain any sort of acronym-y things. Most of them aren't standard, but just to make the slides a little more clean, I pulled some text out, and I will explain them. But what I'd like to do is just share them with you. Offline, I'd love to hear your questions, and not necessarily during this time slot, but at the end or one of the receptions or later on, because I'd love to get your feedback on how these practically apply to you, because we were able to take some sort of theoretical, whether it's a management construct or something from healthcare or another industry, and look around and say, oh, we can do this better. And that sort of was a good thing for us. So the 3 I'd like to share with you, one for BIM strategy. We're going to look at the PDCA or PDAC cycle. I want to share with you a one for selecting your BIM champion, and then one for teaming. And anyone who's done any sort of management reading, this will be very, very familiar, and perhaps you've already done some of this too. So let's talk a little bit about your BIM strategy. So this is based on what's called the Deming cycle, which starts with its plan, do, check, act, right? And so it's this idea that you go through a cycle of things, of processes, and you try and improve them. It's this really amazing concept of continuous improvement, which is so seemingly simple, yet we all struggle with it. You know, I heard even some of the presentations this morning of, you know, David Phelps saying, oh, bringing, you know, information, learning from our buildings and trying to make sure we select the right equipment, as did Deke. And I think those are really important things that we as an industry don't do that well, regardless of where the process is. And so this has been a way for us to formally look at this. So when we talked about our BIM strategy, we wanted to look at our goals, our tactics, and our resources. And we have now applied this to dozens of processes in our firm. Whether it's a project, we go through the same thing. And for us, goals is the most important thing, because we need to know where we're going to, you know, what's our benchmark in the future? What are we trying to hit? And I think what's been really exciting to watch the UK BIM implementation is there are goals. In the US, we don't necessarily have goals that we've all rallied behind. In the UK, there are, you know, they have goals. There's a very clear need for reduction of carbon emissions and a very clear need for cost reduction. And that's where we're focused. And I think that's really a good thing, and I would invite all of you, something I wish we had done, so you can learn from our lessons learned, is not said, we're gonna do everything ever with BIM and never stop and always just, you know, but focus. Where do we really wanna improve? And once we started focusing on reducing waste, we actually saw improvements in a lot of areas, but because we were focusing our efforts in one area, we were able to improve much more holistically. We didn't wanna be, and we were for a time, you know, a mile wide and a centimeter deep, so it is. And so we tried to look at setting goals, and not just our goal is to use BIM, but our goal is to reduce change orders on our projects by 50% by 2015. You know, that SMART goal, you know, so they're specific and measurable and, what is it, achievable, relevant, time-bound. You know, you probably know better than I. But those were really important and a driving force. And once we figured out those specific goals, we related them to projects. This is tough to read. Actually, those of you who are further back probably have a better time with the screens, perhaps. But this is our BIM execution plan framework. And a BIM execution plan to us is the plan we do to sort of follow to make sure we're implementing BIM in a certain way and setting standards and requirements. Penn State University really made this concept really well known in the States, and I believe you can actually download their project execution plan from the Penn State BIM website, and they invite feedback. There's several members from their team here today who you can hear speak, but they really created an opportunity to say, this is what we need to do. We need to plan out how we're going to do BIM in a project. So what we actually do is we took our overall goals and translated them to project goals and tactics. What are our modeling standards, and what are our workflows for that, and what, how are people going to access the model? And if you're a really nerdy Revit person, you're going to want to talk about work sets, and you're going to want to talk about how are we going to set up our templates, and all of those things. And if you're more of a project manager person, which I'm now a little bit of both, I'll definitely still have the nerd. You do want to understand what the implications are and what the time commitment is based on these standards, and what does it mean to model to 1/256, rather than 1/2, or of an inch or whatever. So it's sort of an interesting thing that you start to talk about these things and have a conversation. Excuse me. And you want to take a look at these and really implement them. So we were doing a good job of that. But then here's the really tough part for, I think, everyone in our industry, and it certainly was for us. You have to check what you're doing. So we implemented these things that we call health checks. And we look at it from a data and a measurement standpoint. So how are we doing on our benchmarks and things like that? But how's our process going? And here's a tough one. How does everyone feel about our process? So it's an interesting thing in a male-dominated industry to ask people, well, how do you feel about the process? And what do you think about this? And, how is the interaction going with the superintendent? What are all these things? And we started to ask those questions. And so now I conduct these. You have used a consultant in the past, but we do them ourselves, and we check in with ourselves, with our process, both from a digital perspective, and we check how our files are doing. We check the digital contracts and do quality assurance on the models and compare that to the BEP, and that's a good baseline checking. But we also talk about how it's working out for everyone, and is it burdening the structural engineer too much and benefiting everyone else more at his expense, or something like that. And these are important things to look at. And then, of course, you have to assess, and you have to change courses. You have to adjust where you are. And you want to take a look at how it impacts your goals, and then you either need to change your plan or change your goals. But I think it's an important thing. And then, of course, you keep going, because that's where you are, and it's a cycle. And I think from a continuous improvement perspective, this to us was eye-opening. And I know that it completely seems like, this, well, of course this is what we should do. Absolutely, but I can speak to you honestly, and it's so nice to speak in another country even, because I can speak to you honestly. I don't have clients in the audience that I need to say, no, we're doing this, we're so great, we have all this. I can just say, yeah, this was tough for us. We've learned, we still have a lot of improvement and cycles to go through, but this was a tough thing for us. And so hopefully you'll find some space to implement some continuous improvement in your own processes. The next thing I want to talk to you about is how you pick your BIM champion. And this particular construct is called behavioral public relations. So this is completely from the PR and marketing world. This has nothing to do with us. And what they talk about in behavioral PR is that when you're doing some kind of rollout or a marketing campaign, you want to get all of your target market. Like, how do you get people to believe in something? How do you get them to go out and buy whatever product it is? And so what a lot of, especially consumer-based marketing will do is they divide up all of us, the population, into groups. And on 10%, on each end of the spectrum, about 10% of people are completely useless. Those people are zealots, and they're either really for or really against whatever it is. So you tend to think about something, and I always felt someone who's a real cheerleader of something, like, yeah, they're going to drive it, and they're going to be great. They'd be a great champion. Here's the problem. Everyone else thinks they're crazy. And nobody wants to listen to them because they're so excited about whatever product or whatever, we all have iPhones now, right? Well, most people have, lots of people have Apple products. But how annoying was it, that first person who got the iPhone, and they're like, well, I have this iPhone, and this is so great, and Apple is this, and the integration of the OS, and you're talking too much about this. I don't care anymore. If you had said, oh yeah, it's cool. I didn't know it was going to be that good, but I really like it, and it's attractive and works well, and I don't know, whatever. But it was just too much. Those people are not as useful from a PR perspective, right? So what they do is they look at, so the two ends of the spectrum, and everyone sort of meets in the middle, that middle piece of it. And that middle 8% is really interesting. And they call those thought leaders. And those people, they could go either way, but they're willing to think about it. So not everyone in that middle 8% is willing to think about it. Some people don't care. But for those who are willing to think about it and willing to engage in a conversation and see multiple viewpoints, they're really helpful from a retail perspective. So if you were opening a new retail store, you know who your thought leader would be? This is really interesting, a hairdresser. Because hairdressers tend to see a lot of range of trends. They have to see lots of trends for fashion and things like that. And they don't always have a lot of opinions because they have to basically follow whatever trends there are and stay with whatever's current. And they talk to a lot of people, right? What do you do when you go to the salon or the barber? This would be better with a female audience. I'm sorry, guys. Just bear with me. You get the idea, right? I mean, you can picture it, right? That what do? You sit there and you listen, and they just talk. So if you're opening a store, you should tell hairdressers, don't waste your money marketing to everybody. Focus on the people who can spread the message. So how do we translate this to us? It's, some of you may already be seeing some of the the clean parallels, right? So we very rarely pick the person who says, I hate BIM, as our BIM champion. We actually tend to pick the cheerleader, the one who says, BIM is great, and this is what we should do, and we're gonna, they're gonna pick sort of the me person who's just really rallying on this thing. I don't know that I'm the best BIM champion, because if somebody doesn't believe in BIM, they know that I'm always going to pick BIM. I've sort of alienated them in some ways, right? And so it's really interesting to think about when you pick your person who's either best at it or so excited about it as your champion, they actually can hurt your efforts in some ways, right? And this was interesting to us, especially because, for those of you who don't know me, I was the BIM champion at Tocci. I started the BIM department. I pulled this together, but of course I'm so excited about it and always believe in BIM to the point that I couldn't see when there were opportunities or projects that we should do less BIM on. Like, more BIM was always better. And that was a challenge, I think, for us. And I think it was hard for our project managers who really hated BIM, but also hard for those who would have been open to it or were more open to it, but maybe a little less. Or maybe they just didn't want to be pushed so hard. So it's an interesting thing to see yourself in one of these categories and to admit that you may not be the best person for the championing of BIM. And you'll notice I don't have BIM in my title for a reason. But what you want to do is look at your project managers or an estimator or someone on the team who is really well connected. Who's the person that everyone goes to with their questions or their problems, right? Who's the guy or gal that is well connected in the office? I've seen some companies actually quite effectively make maps of the connections of people, because it's not about the formal connections, it's about your informal connections. It's the fact that in our office, Joe Cavallero and Joe Farolito get together for 2 hours almost every day, and I think they're just chatting. I think they're just catching up almost every day. But you know what? Then Joe Cavallero goes and talks to this PM over here, and he talks to Victor and Angela and all these different people, and he's really well connected. And so when you start to look at what are these sort of channels of communication that are already well worn into the company that we can benefit from, and which ones do we need to look out to? And that's sort of a different process, but you also want to think about that when you're selecting your BIM champion. And again, we're not talking about the person who's going to make your Revit standards or your ArchiCAD standards. We're talking about the person who's going to promote and evangelize BIM. You actually don't necessarily want an evangelist. And so just some things to think about with that you might want to pick somebody who's a little bit different than you originally thought. And lastly, so you've got your strategy, you've got your champion, your thought leader, you're putting your team together, and especially when processes are unknown and we're trying something new and it's different. And by the way, nobody likes change, right? I mean, babies barely like having their diaper changed, and come on, right? Like, why wouldn't you want that? But nobody wants change. And you have to look at teams a little bit differently. And so I'm going to walk you through Tuckman, like 4 stages of team development, for those of you who are checking it off in a management book somewhere as well. But I think the other thing to think about, that as you overlay this really talks about people coming together and doesn't perfectly align with phases of design and construction. And I'll share a little bit about that as well, but I mean, different phases require different management styles too. So we look at, we actually saw this sort of as a looking backwards, because we went through bringing a really large team together, and it was really exciting, but man, it was hard. And I had just finished reading something about Tuckman and was thinking about this project and said, wait a minute, we just went through that. 4 stages: forming, we're coming together. We're all really nice to each other because we don't know who we're gonna align with and what's gonna quite happen, and especially in an environment that's really open, we're all gonna collaborate really openly. This used a unique contract form that allowed us to all collaborate. You're sort of feeling things out, because the alliances that you have between traditional subcontractors and the design teams, you don't necessarily know what's gonna play out on an innovative contract form. So forming, we're coming together, we're really, figuring it out. Then the next one is called storming, and I'll go through a few more slides, but I'll stay on this one for just a minute. Storming is when we all figure out that we can't really work together and we don't know what this is, and what are you doing with my files, and how is this gonna happen? And then of course, there's, on a really complex project, that's the point when the goals become really overwhelming, right? I mean, well, what do you mean we have to complete this in 9 months? We talked about a 15-month schedule. This is, when you're not going to increase the budget, or we don't have, this is when we really start to get stressed. And stressed, I don't know about you, but it does not bring out the best in me. I don't think it brings out the best in anybody. But some people seem to handle it a little better than others. But that's that stress point when we all storm. And then all of a sudden, something happens. And on this project, it just sort of seemed to happen. And we're norming. We're normalizing. We're figuring out what our standards, what our routines, what we do, and who we are. We're talking about those things. And then once we figure out and we have a good calm baseline, then we're performing. And as you can see in the graphic on the upper right there, you do see a little strife before we sort of jump up and can actually perform as a team. And I think in my just brief time that I have left, what I do want to say about this particular thing is that each stage requires a different management style. And this is really tough. I think I saw it being tough for our project managers who, although they're project managers, they weren't necessarily people managers. They didn't think a lot about management style. They thought a lot about processing submittals and requests for information and change orders and other documents, and they were really good at that. And some of them just happened to seem to have more charisma or more connection with people or a better sense of mentoring than others, but didn't necessarily think about management style. And I think if I can impress anything on all of you is that just think about and notice this in your teams, that you need to do different things for them. During forming, this is that uncomfortable period when you do have to tell people things and give them direction and have a little bit more control, because you can't let the whole thing go. Storming is actually an important thing that you need to let it happen, but you also need to, this is called selling management style, I suppose. You want to facilitate people working together. You want to see where the trouble points are and connect them together. You don't want to prevent storming from happening, but you want to try and facilitate it and get through it a little bit more productively. During this stage, norming, the team is really going to start to self-manage and self-figure out. So this is when you just support them and enable them and motivate them, as it's called, and keep that going. And then, of course, once they're performing, get out of the way, right? But I think there's a piece of it that you still have to remember to observe and manage and think about checking in and those sort of things. So I've run a little bit close to the end, I'm very aware, but I did want to just recap a little bit so that you can at least remember, think about what was helpful for you or not. I know that these things have been in varying degrees helpful and really interesting perspectives for us. And as I close, I would like to invite you to think about making a little bit of space Whether you're an owner, a contractor, a design team member, think about where in your company, where in your project team, can you make a little bit of space for the sociology, for thinking about how humans are interacting, for planning things out a little bit more strategically. Abraham Lincoln said, if I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 sharpening my axe. So I hope that you will all think about different ways, even if these aren't those ways, to do exactly that. Thank you.